Greetings, folks. I'd like to thank everybody for being here. I'd like to thank just the fact that I've been invited. Once upon a time, I used to do a lot of multimedia arts. I'm still a composer and musician, but for quite some time I've been teaching, not just music, but I've been teaching history and media studies, which is where I met Sarah. She was a student of mine in Berkeley, and met a lot of great people doing that. And so I'm a director of Project Censored also, which is a media watchdog group and activist group, and we publish this book every year. Of course, it's a different book every year, full of all the stories that you might likely know, but the rest of people around that don't, really tune in or actively participate or are active agents in information collection, they don't know about. Project Censored's been around for 35 years, and I'm, again, proud to be heading that. We're working on our next work right now. But this evening, I'm here to talk about the theme, and Sarah wanted me to come and say a few things about, you heard what she said, and actually the film that we just saw really just sort of laid it out. You could fill tomes, too, with all the things that are in the film, but the film is very powerful. Diary of a Scapegoat. So what I'm supposed to do, I suppose, is sort of set a frame for the evening, although the frame should be borderless. What exactly is a scapegoat? So we're going to get into that very briefly. But when I was first invited to speak, Diary of a Scapegoat, I guess I'll show my age on this one. The first thing I thought of was Diary of a Madman, right? And in that case, it was Ozzy Osbourne and Randy Rhoads in 1981. By the way, they were recording that album 31 years ago this week. So it was kind of an interesting, timely thing. And of course, that title riffs on an old Russian short story that talks about alienation and state repression. Again, pretty timely. And it also links into the theme of Diary of a Scapegoat. And if you remember the first stanza in Diary of a Madman, this sort of riffs off it. And instead of Diary of a Madman, we say Diary of a Scapegoat, because in history, mad persons, mad men, they were seen as what? Well, they were often blamed for a lot of the falsehoods, the foibles, the shortcomings of society. But in many cases, people that were seen as insane or as witches or warlocks or mad persons were actually truth tellers, like the midwives of the Middle Ages. They knew things that the established power structure and plutocrats didn't know, and they were demonized. So madmen and truth tellers and scapegoats and mad women all seem to have some relationships in human history. And thinking about, again, when I first heard the title Diary of a Scapegoat, I thought, well, Diary of a Scapegoat on the front lines again today. We occupy through diffusion. Dear diary, we're here to stay. Meaning the occupiers of the world are not the 1%. They're the rest of us. And we are relentlessly and savagely scapegoated on a daily basis throughout history. And this is our moment in our generation to stand, and the artwork and the expression around this room really captures a zeitgeist. And it's something that's very important and people should really remember. When we go and look at what the term scapegoat culturally, if you go back in the, you can go back to Hebrew, coming out of Leviticus, the scapegoat, the goat, it's all of the sins and the negativity of the society is heaped upon this animal. And the animal is shunned and sent out of town in a celebratory ritual where everyone else kind of gets to vicariously shed their own sort of shortcomings or dark sides. And allegedly, this goat goes out of the village and disappears and is to perish. And with it, legend goes all the ills of the society. Well, that hasn't exactly happened yet, has it? So the idea of the scapegoat is fairly old. It again involves this idea of one being blamed or punished for the sins, crimes, sufferings, etc. of others, generally as a way of distracting attention from the real causes of the ills and ailments of the society. So the scapegoat serves a useful psychosocial purpose in a given culture, albeit, one would argue, a dysfunctional one. So Diary of a Scapegoat, then, is sort of this record of what are we and how do we function, then, as these scapegoats. And when we look at the memes coming out of the Occupy movement of the 99% and then the 1% plutocracy, we are all scapegoats. We've been scapegoats throughout history, and if we look, again, through global history very quickly, a history of the West and a history of even Western interpretations of Christianity, Jesus is often seen as the original scapegoat. That's obviously not true in global history. But in terms of Western culture and Christianity, it goes into this kind of capacity. It actually goes through Greece. But beyond that, in Rome, it was Jesus as the scapegoat. And through this sacrifice, people can somehow live on and live past and live beyond. Because everything is good now. These have been nothing but bait and switch shell games throughout history that have continued to operate in ways to obfuscate state repression and oppression and the abuse of the human spirit. And so again, the Diary of the Scapegoat is a long, vernacular, grassroots, bottom-up narrative of the 99%. So when people argue in the present that, well, 99% doesn't exactly explain it because the upper middle class includes 10 or 15%, and they get into all these, microeconomic types of analysis of, post-state capitalist ideals. But when we look in the long term in global history, we really are talking about the oppression of 99% of people that have walked the planet, that have been oppressed by a very small percentage of people. And in the United States in particular, it starts with the British colonies and the genocide of the Native Americans. It continues with the subjugation of African slavery and the Great Diaspora. This kind of oppression, this kind of scapegoating, these people don't fit, these people aren't wanted, these people aren't good enough, these people can be lorded over. That's all part of the theme. But if you go and look at the narratives of these people and you listen to their stories, they're very similar to all of our own. That's the diary, the vernacular story of a people's history. With respect to Howard Zinn, naturally. And Francis Fitzgerald, and all the other vernacular historians that came about before them that weren't granted academic posts and didn't get paid any attention. Their stories were real. So through history and narrative, and we have a long history of scapegoating in this country, going back and looking for the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. It's a demonization process. It's just not about Catholicism and Protestant angst against Catholicism and the English against the French. It's a power structure, and it's us, them, and it's binary consciousness. It's a long thread of imperial thought, and it goes back a long ways. But even under the guise of freedom, see, this is again the most insidious guise that this can come through, is that you saw in the film here the rhetoric that's used about things that have gone on in the so-called Arab Spring. And by the way, don't forget that originally people like Hillary Clinton were very against what was happening in Egypt, and they were very supportive of Mubarak because the United States supported Mubarak for 30-odd years, 32 years, repressing the Egyptian population, until there was, Malcolm Gladwell, a tipping point, and things began to change. And within 6 weeks, the State Department went from saying that these are a bunch of rabble, violent, terrorist extremists to this is the new voice of democracy, and Mubarak's got to go. That's a pretty quick turnaround, and it also shows another parable from the Bible. It's called Hypocrisy. That film there has got to be one of the best examples of that in recent history. when it talks about how we have this, we lionize the protesters. Time magazine, right? Time magazine lionizes protester as person of the year over there. But in Oakland, California, Iraqi veterans like Scott Olson get smashed in the face by alleged public servants. And then they're scapegoated and called the villain. That is an illness. Scapegoating comes from a deep-rooted social illness. And the diary of this story is to try to reclaim the vernacular narrative and change this phenomenon right now. This is our time while we're here in this time-space continuum. And we have an obligation to our children and people that are not here yet to rectify these situations. And that's what this show is about. Not only do we go through the slaves and the genocide of Native Americans, we go through the demonization of immigrants, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the demonization of the Spaniards, the false liberation of Cubans, Filipinos, and Puerto Ricans in the Spanish-American War. We go through the Red Scare and the demonization of Germans and communists and Russians in 1917 to 1919. In this country. In World War II, we demonized the Germans and Japanese again, where we finally lifted the veil of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act just in time for Federal Order 9066, where we locked up 120,000 Japanese Americans and threw them in prison camps in the deserts while we were fighting fascism in Europe. Kind of funny, isn't it? 2/3 of those people were American citizens. So much for due process. This is, again, a part of scapegoating. It's a deep-rooted component of our culture. We've went through it in the McCarthy era. We've long demonized the labor movement in this country. We've demonized anarchists, socialists, and anybody that has ever stood up for anybody else, brother, sister, animal, nature, otherwise, because it was getting run roughshod over by the 1% in the name of capital accumulation. That has to stop, or our planet is going to die. And as George Carlin said, it's not going to really die in a sense that we think of it egotistically. It's going to die in a way that makes it uninhabitable for us and other living things. As Greg Palast, the BBC journalist, an American who works at the BBC because he can't write here, because he tells the truth sometimes. This is why we occupy. There is no alternative. If you go back to the great civil rights period of the 60s, Martin Luther King wrote from his letter in the Birmingham jail, this is a very important thing that applies to what's going on right now, and that is involving the demonization and scapegoating of the Occupy movement as the progenitors of violence, and the state is merely a responsible respondent to that violence. Quote, says King, "You deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham," read Oakland, "but your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins? Why marches? And so forth. Isn't negotiation a better path?" King added, "Nonviolent direct action seeks to so dramatize the issue of oppression that it can no longer be ignored. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressors. It must be demanded by the oppressed. For years now we have heard the word wait. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied." And we hear the same calls today. Wait. What's going on with Occupy? What are their demands? Who are their leaders? Oh, it's an election season. Let's co-opt some of their demands. No. There is no wait. The time is now. There is no negotiating. There's no negotiating about injustice. And that is where the Occupy movement stands in the present. This also is very, very closely related. Of course, the scapegoating to bring King up to the present, where we saw just this last week the Berkeley Police Department when not responding to a call in the Berkeley Hills where a man was being assaulted. The reason they gave for not being able to respond was that they had to watch the Occupy Oakland movement march into Berkeley. So now the public servants are claiming that the Occupy are scapegoats. Again, we can't do our jobs because these unruly hooligans won't go away. We can't protect people from violence because we're busy meting it out on others. That's pretty close to home and pretty recent. Well, what we're really talking about in the Occupy movement, by the way, is also something that is historical in nature, though historical in a pejorative way that it's mostly forgotten, and that is what we occupy for. It's the commons. That which is part of a history of human heritage that is rightfully ours. We inhabit the earth and have the rights to all that the earth offers equally to be shared. This ethos of the commons and the enclosure movements of colonialism coming out of Britain in the 1700s are a long battle. If you've not checked out a history of the commons and the enclosure movement, I invite you to do so, because this is why we occupy. Right? When the Occupy movement attempted to occupy an abandoned building in downtown Oakland, notice the swiftness with which the public police, we pay their salaries, came to protect private property. But they didn't go to protect a person in the Berkeley Hills while he was brutally murdered. Property. And guess what? If you go back to John Locke and then through the Declaration of Independence with the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that originally comes from John Locke with the right and the life, liberty, and the pursuit of private property. And property is the genesis of rights. And that is bullshit. Corporations have come to then encapsulate this idea of enclosing on the commons. And corporations have somehow claimed personhood, where they can enclose anything that they desire for profit, and all of the rest that goes along with the history of us as people on the planet is cast aside. Again, I think to give us hope in some guise, not the faux elixirs of hope and change peddled by PR agencies that sell toothpaste and presidential candidates, but the kind that has historical vision and comes from the peasants of Britain in the 1700s, along with many other cultures for thousands of years, is a great poem. And I want you to think about what it means and why we occupy. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose who steals the common from off the goose. The law demands that we atone when we take things we do not own, but leaves the lords and ladies fine who take things that are yours and mine, all of ours. The poor and wretched don't escape if they conspire the law to break. This must be so, but they endure those who conspire to make the law. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, and geese will still a common lack until they go and steal it back. That's from 1764, and that's why we occupy in 2012. That story has legs. Well, I could go on certainly about the use of scapegoating in our history and why we have scapegoated certain groups, because they have offered the promise of universal human rights, by the way, that are ensconced in the Declaration of Human Rights at the UN from 1948. I urge you to read them. I could get into false flags, false flag terrorism, the purposeful erection of the state to create scapegoats out of thin air. We don't have time for that. But I also urge you to think about this. And I'll end with this. This is a very brief letter that was written by an American veteran from the Iraq War, Iraq occupation, to use the term occupation in another sense, Micah Dutt. And he posted this in Occupy Portland, and I wanted to end with this. A friend of mine, Margaret Flowers, who's done a lot of great work and published stuff in our book on single-payer health care and how it's been censored out as a human right from the corporate media and political dialogue in the United States, the land of the free. But this is, again, I think, a really powerful statement. And I think it'll resonate with a lot of you. And I think it has everything to do with every single expression and piece of work that people are bringing here this evening. And by the way, talk about a scapegoat. Julian Assange, as Joe Biden called him, a high-tech terrorist, and Bradley Manning. That's the diary of a scapegoat right there. We criminalize truth-tellers and we let liars inhabit the Oval Office. Says veteran Sergeant Micah Dutt. This is in response to family members questioning him. He comes back, an Iraqi veteran, and his family members say to him, "Why are you involved with these dregs?" Right? Scapegoating. "Why are you involved with these lowlifes, these homeless, these sex offender, drug addicts?" Fox News went so far as to say the Occupy movement was a front for Al-Qaeda, which is, of course, a CIA creation. And they blamed Acorn. But says Dutt, in response to people that constantly ask him, "Aren't you a patriotic American? Why do you hang out with these people? Why are you doing this?" Here's his response. Dutt says, "I see a government that has been at war for every decade since its inception. I see a government that committed a gross genocide against the native populations in order to steal their land. I see a government that has enabled corporations to steal from the public through government contracts and kickbacks. Furthermore, I see a diseased society in which people value money more than happiness, peace, love, and understanding, and compassion. I see a United States as it really is, a selfish, indulgent, hateful, ignorant, and violent nation." And of course, Dutt was part of that. "I see a nation that has destroyed the concept of community and replaced it with institution. I see a nation that has destroyed critical thinking and replaced it with repetitious thought. I see a nation that destroyed art, creativity, and passion and replaced it with rules, regulations, and formalities. I see a nation who uses wars around the world in order to maintain a peace at home. A peace that isn't built on community, equality, and love. No, a peace that is built on material goods, consumerism, and self-indulgence. So what am I doing about it? I'm no longer participating. My life is an act of rebellion. I will not participate in a society that places thieves and murderers in positions of honor while enslaving for profit millions of people through our bullshit judicial system. I cut out all unnecessary expenses. Instead of going out to eat, I go to massive community potlucks. Instead of going to the bar, I go to a friend's house. Instead of going to a show, we throw concerts in backyards, basements, and living rooms. Or here. Instead of going to a show, we throw concerts, backyards, basements, living rooms, attend workshops put on by affinity groups, learn, teach about oppressions of all types, religious-based, gender-based, race-based, sex-based, economic-based, etc. I sit in union halls and help workers strike against megacorporations that want to strip them of their rights. I hang out with street kids and lawyers. I attend nightly potlucks. I share what I have with those in need. I protest. I, and thousands with me, call out those thieves and murderers in public through civil disobedience. I teach, I give classes on American history using a people's history of the United States. I give speeches, I sit on panels in churches and libraries and homes and parks and anywhere else I am invited to. Which kind of spoke to me because that's what I do. I speak to the media. I am the media. We're the media. By the way, we have a show every Friday on KPFA at 8 a.m. and you're invited to be part of it. I try in the best way I know how to share a revolutionary message that places community over institution. I share my knowledge of America's vast history of oppression. I form friendships. I meet people of all types and backgrounds. I encourage them and they encourage me. I help them and they help me. We are dedicated to social change and our friendships are forged through collective struggle. We are creative. We can come up with creative ways to explain and reveal the vast corruption in the American system. We make posters and costumes. I share ideas. We in turn share those ideas and put them into essays, actions, speeches, posters, pictures, and movies. We are fools. We know that society doesn't want to hear this message, in some part. We know that society is more than comfortable with genocide, population manipulation, consumerism, greed, pride, hatred, and ignorance, but we refuse to play along. We are creating a new world, and we are creating it right now. Our lives are the first casualties in the revolution. We are sacrificing our comfort, privilege, and apathy in order to show people that a new world is possible. Those are the words from Sergeant Micah Dutt. And I invite all of you to think about those words and think about what it means to be part of a movement of the 99% that is reclaiming our heritage as human beings on a planet that insists to live in a just world. And together, we will do that. Thank you very much.